사라진 일상, 헝클어진 질서가 지배하는 세상. 우리의 내일은 어디에 있는가? 세계지식포럼.
We'll now begin our first session titled A Conversation with Theresa May. As you know, Theresa May served as the 76th Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and leader of the Conservative Party from 2016 to 2019. Mr. Terry Martin, senior anchor with DW News, a fellow journalist, good to see you, will be moderating this session, so I will leave further introductions to our moderator and now turn the mic over to you. Terry, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that kind, warm introduction. It's a great privilege and honor for me to be here again at the World Knowledge Forum, particularly with Lady May. This is my third time at the World Knowledge Forum in Korea, and I am amazed that this is happening at all. I want to give the organizers a round of applause for making this happen, because this did not seem possible to me when it was announced. I just want to congratulate you on making this happen at all. This is a wonderful event. Glad to see this happening. This is a return to normalcy for me as well. Lady May has come here all the way to join us as well, which is quite an impressive feat in itself. I'm going to quickly outline what we'll be doing over the next 45-50 minutes, and then we'll jump straight into it. We already have an introduction. I don't think I need to introduce Theresa May anymore, except to say that in addition to having served as Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party, she was also a cabinet secretary for a number of years before that. She has been a member of Parliament in the United Kingdom for more than 20 years, representing Maidenhead in Berkshire. And she continues to sit in Parliament today and continues to shape developments in the United Kingdom and beyond. We're going to begin by talking a little bit about Brexit. There's no way of getting around this, the United Kingdom deciding to leave the European Union. We'll then talk a little about leadership, we'll talk about China, we'll talk about the influence of media on democracies, and we will conclude then with just a couple of questions from the audience. I understand there are some very interesting questions coming here, just a couple of them, about 5 minutes we'll leave for that at the end. We'll try to wrap up punctually. Now, just a bit of background on Brexit. As you all know, the UK formally left the European Union on January 31st of this year. But the withdrawal has not been fully implemented yet. It's in a transition phase as negotiations continue over the future trading relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union. Those negotiations are currently in a very challenging phase, shall we say. Now, Lady May, I know that you're really not at liberty to talk about the details of those trade negotiations, but I was thinking perhaps you could talk a little more generally about Brexit. So I'll just begin by asking you, how is Brexit going?
Well, it is going, it is happening, that's the key thing. And as you say, Terry, crucially, formally we have left the European Union, but we negotiated this transition period while the future relationship was being finally put in place. Those negotiations are due to come to an end at the end of this month. There is a process that the European Commission and the European Union has to go through of ratification of any treaty that is agreed, which requires time before the end of December, which is the end of the transition period. And the negotiations are at a very crucial point at the moment. As you say, I can't comment on the details of those. Those are negotiations are carrying on, I think probably not as we speak, because it is in the early hours of the morning in the UK, but will be continuing this week. Crucially, there is an issue that has arisen from those negotiations. The UK government has taken a stance on its, the withdrawal agreement that it signed last December. It wishes to change some of those arrangements. I find that quite difficult because it's an international agreement, and I think we should abide by the international agreement. So there is a debate in Parliament this week and next week on how that should progress and what response the UK should have to that aspect of the agreement. But on the 31st of December, we will finally, properly, completely leave the European Union.
I find it very refreshing to be here in East Asia and look back at Europe from this perspective. I live in Germany on the continent. I've lived there now for 30 years. Brexit is something that I followed very closely as a journalist throughout the referendum period and the torturous negotiations that followed that. I'm just wondering, perhaps you can explain to our audience how you see the UK's relationship to Europe in general. Do you see the UK as an integral part of Europe, or is it a completely separate entity?
The phrase that we used to use is that we were leaving the European Union, we were not leaving Europe. So the UK will still very much be part of Europe, and we want, and I think it's important, that we continue to have a very good relationship with our European neighbours. They are our allies, they are our closest geographical neighbours. Of course, the UK has always had a particular role within Europe because of its special relationship with the United States of America. So its position has always been slightly different in that sense, but we will continue to be part of Europe. But as we leave the European Union, we are looking more as a United Kingdom to look to perhaps increase our relationships around the rest of the world as well. And some of those issues are about trade. We're very keen. We were very pleased to agree the continuity agreement of trade with South Korea. We hope to enhance our trading relationship with Korea as we do with other parts of the world. So we're looking to that global Britain, but we will still very much be working with our allies in Europe and be part of Europe.
For countries, also South Korea, it's now a little more complicated because there's not just one entity to negotiate with in those terms, but two. I'm wondering, how do you see Brexit impacting the UK's and the EU's ability to compete and to shape world affairs?
Well, I think that obviously, as you say, in terms of trading relationships, there will now be the two entities of the European Union and the United Kingdom. Although many of the trading relationships that the European Union had negotiated and the UK had been part of as part of the EU, we have been able to continue once we leave the EU, but we look to enhance those. We want to increase those trading relationships and perhaps build new trading relationships around the world. I'm not sure that changes the EU's position very much in terms of their ability to trade. But of course, you talk about the influence that the EU and the UK have in terms of international affairs. The UK, again, has a particular position as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. So it has always had that slightly different relationship with, as regards the whole of the European Union. I want to see the United Kingdom continuing to play a key role in the development of international relationships. I think one of the challenges we have in world politics today is, and it was reflected in the opening remarks for the forum here today, is the way in which we see in so many areas the breakdown of international cooperation. And the former Secretary General has referenced that issue about the world needing to work together, particularly on these key challenges like climate change, which we will not solve as individual nations. We each have our part to play, but we have to work together. And the United Kingdom has always been a strong believer in those general multilateral institutions, the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, and ensuring that those multilateral institutions are able to continue to play a role against a background of increasing nationalism in world politics, I think is very important. And I want to see the UK playing a role in ensuring those institutions can continue to play their part.
Okay, let's talk about leadership. This is something you have a lot of experience with. You've experienced really difficult times in the UK, leading your party and the country through a very difficult phase. He served as Prime Minister of one of the world's most advanced and admired countries, but it went through that phase of wrenching turmoil during the Brexit referendum and the government's handling of it. When you assess what happened under your predecessor, David Cameron, and your successor, Boris Johnson, and under your own leadership, what lessons can you draw?
Well, I think that the key lesson to me of the referendum, which led to us leaving the European Union, was that although this was a question about our membership of the EU, and people voted on that, they also voted, I think, for change. And this was a reflection of something that we see elsewhere in world politics today, which was this sense that globalization had not been good for everybody, that there were those who had benefited significantly from it, and then there were communities and people who had been left behind by globalization. In a sense, this was brought into a focus with the 2008 financial crisis, but this was a sense that had been building. And I think the EU referendum in the UK gave people an opportunity to express that desire for change, that perhaps politicians weren't listening to all of the voices and weren't responding to all of the needs in a country. So I think that was one of the key lessons that came out of that period, and it's important that now in politics in the UK, we respond to those needs as well as the key issue of leaving the EU. So politics in the UK isn't just about Brexit. It's about an awful lot more. And ensuring economic development, economic dynamism across the whole of the country, ensuring that we see communities that have been left behind are able to be brought up and enhanced and developed so that people feel it is, as the phrase I used, is a country that works for everyone, not just for the few.
I should point out, just to remind everyone, that Theresa May was not the Prime Minister who actually launched the referendum in the UK. That was her predecessor, David Cameron. And then you came in and tried to find some consensus in Parliament, which proved extremely difficult. I would ask you, if you could go back and change anything in the way you led your own country and your party, would you?
I think that in terms of the implementation of Brexit, the approach I took was that a referendum which resulted in a vote where 52% of people voted to leave and 48% chose to remain was so close that we had to try to bring people together and develop a future relationship with the European Union that involved leaving the EU and its political institutions, but still recognize the concerns that the 48% who voted remain had had. I suppose if there's one thing that when I look back, should have paid more attention to, it was that I assumed that that would be a general sense in Parliament, that people would feel the need to come together and find a solution for the whole of the country. And what we saw in Parliament was the division between the Brexiteers, the Leavers, and the Remainers growing. The division grew stronger and deeper. I had always expected that people who had campaigned to leave for their entire political career would then vote what was necessary in order to execute that departure, but they didn't. That was my deal, and they voted against it. I had not expected them to do that. I had expected people who wanted to leave to be willing to vote for a deal to leave. They have done now, but some of them are now trying to undo that in Parliament. That's the debate in Parliament today.
So if I understand you correctly, you're saying that if you could go back and change something, you would work harder to achieve consensus in Parliament, or?
Yes, it would be trying to overcome that increasing division, try to build, encourage more people to understand the importance of the consensus. But again, if I may develop this into more widely into what I see in world politics today, I worry that politics today all too often is characterized by a lack of willingness to compromise. And I think that, we all know in our day-to-day lives, compromise is important. It is important sometimes in politics. But we see an era in politics today of absolutism, that you have to be either 100% in favor of this or 100% against it. And on something like the referendum, it was important to bring those two sides together and for each side to compromise to some extent, to find a solution that fitted everybody, that everybody could coalesce behind. But that sense of compromise was, for some, lacking, and that caused difficulties. But that is, I think, also a representation of what we see in world politics today, and a greater willingness not to compromise, to be unwilling to compromise.
The referendum was, of course, it was hotly contested, shall we say. The media played a very important role in that, social media as well. Some say that the polarization that you're describing in political culture, some are calling it also cancel culture now in popular terms. What role do you see the media, and social media in particular, playing in that process of polarization? And do you feel it is a threat, a potential threat to democracy insofar as it influences elections and referendums?
Well, social media can be a huge positive in terms of our democracies, in encouraging debate, encouraging comment, encouraging people to be involved. But there is also a potential negative, which is the way in which extreme positions and extreme views can be exacerbated and can be encouraged through social media. Somebody who perhaps has an extreme view that in normal circumstances most people would not listen to can put that across social media, and others around the world who have that view can latch onto that, and it becomes echoed, and the voice increases as a result of that. And so you can get these increased polarization because people are seeing and just being followed by people who approve of their view and follow their view, and you sometimes don't get the debate and the challenge that you need to those extreme views. So social media can be hugely positive, encouraging people to be involved, but on the other hand, it can exacerbate extreme views. And I think that is, and politicians I don't think have quite worked out how to deal with that.
We could spend the rest of this session talking about the impact of disinformation and misinformation on various political processes that are happening in the world right now, not least the US election. But I want to get to the heart of what is happening right now in the world that's affecting everyone around the globe. And that, of course, is COVID-19, the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus that we're all dealing with. I want to talk about the pursuit of a vaccine and how that might be developed and rolled out and delivered universally. Many countries are worried about vaccine nationalism, that some countries will rush to get the vaccine and then hoard the vaccine itself for their own countrymen and countrywomen. Are you convinced that rich countries like the UK, which is also pushing very hard to develop a vaccine, are making sufficient effort to assure universal access to the vaccine, a potential coronavirus vaccine?
Well, first of all, I may say I'm interested to be here in South Korea because South Korea has dealt very well with the COVID-19 pandemic, and it is interesting to see how that has been achieved here. It is the case, obviously, as we heard, that if you look at some of the vaccine developments, the Oxford University vaccine, the link with AstraZeneca, as we saw, the trials in Brazil, potential for that vaccine to be manufactured in Korea and Mexico. I think that shows an international cooperation on an issue such as that, which is very important. Of course, the race for a vaccine is being pursued across the world in a number of countries. In the UK, we've made certain commitments in terms of trying to ensure that a vaccine can be available for developing countries, particularly around the world. There are those countries who may try to ensure that a vaccine is not just predominantly available for their citizens, but potentially available there and not elsewhere. I think this is such an important issue that we all work together to ensure that we're dealing with this pandemic as a world community. I am very sorry that in the early stages of this pandemic, we saw very little real international cooperation around how to deal with the pandemic. Countries dealing with it in their own way, rather than perhaps sitting down and discussing and sorting out what the best way to deal with the pandemic was. I hope in the vaccine we're seeing more international cooperation. The scientists are cooperating. It would be good to see the politicians cooperating on this as well.
Indeed, COVID-19 has cut connections between people, between cities, between countries, indeed. Globalization, some say, has been dealt perhaps a lethal blow, that it's being pushed back very hard. There is some cooperation, as you say, particularly in the scientific community. But when it comes to reviving a multilateral approach to global problems, which, as Ban Ki-moon pointed out, is absolutely essential for dealing with problems like climate change, how should the world go about reconnecting? What can be done by world leaders to advance this reconnection, perhaps not globalization in the way we had it, but something new? How do you see that happening?
Well, first of all, I liked the phrase that was used in some of the opening remarks about social distancing turning into national distancing. I think this is a real problem that we do have to watch out for. There's going to be a natural inclination in countries, and we see it in the UK and elsewhere, to look at issues like global supply chains and to say, should we be manufacturing more in our own countries to provide greater resilience for the future? And I think that will naturally occur. But there's a real challenge which was already developing to world trade, which the pandemic could exacerbate and which we need to avoid. South Korea and the United Kingdom are both trading nations. We believe in free trade. we both encourage free trade and want to see that free trade around the world. But the institutions of free trade, the World Trade Organization, was already under challenge. Largely, obviously, the United States of America has taken a different approach currently in recent years to the WTO. I think it is for those of us who share the values, who still believe in world trade, to stand up and be counted, to work together to ensure that we can maintain those global frameworks that have done the world well. Yes, there are those, as I said earlier, who feel that globalization has left them behind. The way to deal with that is not to dismantle globalization, it is to ensure that it is working for everybody. It is in all our interests to continue to see that those movements around the world, that world trade that we've seen in the past and development of that world trade, it is in everybody's economic interests, and particularly in the economic interests of the developing countries, because it is trade that can enhance economies, that can lead to improvement in people's lives. So I think for those countries that share that view, we should work together and stand up and be counted on this issue and challenge those who take a different view.
Dr. Chang, the chairman of the World Knowledge Forum, in his remarks earlier, pointed out that massive debt is being piled up by countries and groups of countries to try to overcome the immediate economic impact of COVID-19. Trillions of dollars are being pumped into economies. Does this debt that is building up, also in the UK, concern you?
It has to be a matter of concern, I think, to us all, because we have to take the decision as to how to deal with that debt, and there will be some real challenges to come. And the United Kingdom has still that discussion to have as to whether to deal with the debt more immediately, or there are those who argue that it should be set to one side in a sense as one would have done with, say, a war debt, and dealt with in that way. So we need to be concerned about it. I think it is right that countries acted in the way that they did in order to reduce the immediate impact on individuals and businesses of the pandemic. I think that was important. But we can't simply sort of say, right, okay, that's it, we've done that, let's go back to normal. We have to find a way of dealing with that debt, and that challenge of the extent to which you, through taxation or spending reduction, start to deal with it more immediately will be coming to us all.
Indeed, I have two sons. They're both studying at this point, and I think about what the world will be like for them 5 or 10 years from now, and it's impossible to say at this point. Anyway, just because we only have a certain amount of time, and there's so much we want to hear from you, I'm going to move on. There will be much more about Pandenomics, and of course the COVID-19 crisis during this forum over the next 3 days. I'll be hosting a session on Wednesday myself in the morning with 3 leading figures developing vaccines in the world. So there's a lot more to be heard about this topic, both in the economic sphere and in the medical sphere as well. So I would like to move on, because when you were Prime Minister, you were not just dealing with Brexit, of course. You were responsible for everything that a leader of one of the most advanced countries in the world has to deal with, including China. And China is still very much on the radar of global affairs at this point. The UK is among the countries, not just in the West, who are concerned about how to deal with China. I was just speaking to the former Prime Minister here about China. It is a concern in this region, of course, too. Inevitably, it's so close. You cannot ignore it. But it's a challenge dealing with China on multiple fronts. It's also an opportunity dealing with China. as a major and rising power, but there are concerns about global trade, intellectual property, defense, human rights. What do you see as the main challenges, not just for the UK, but generally in dealing with China?
Well, the first thing I would say is that, as you yourself, Terry, have just set out, China brings challenges but also opportunities. And the rest of the world can't sort of try to stand back and act as if China is not there and is not a significant economic presence in the world. We have to deal with that. Of course, here in this part of the world, you will feel very particularly that presence of China and of China's future expectations and some of the actions that China is taking. I think that the ideal for the world is to be able to find a way in which we can bring China into the rules-based framework, the international rules-based frameworks, into some of the multilateral institutions in a way that sees us able to ensure that they are meeting some of the norms of behavior that the rest of the world would see. Now, China would say, I'm sure, that there are organizations which were established and rules that were established before it was part of the discussion, and why should it meet the same rules as everybody else? So there may be some reform necessary, but actually ensuring that there is that sort of global framework on things like trade, on issues like intellectual property, that everybody can work to, is the ideal that we need to try to achieve. How do we get there? We don't get there by setting up this sort of either you're with China or, well, let's face it, or you're with the United States, which is the sort of argument that appears to be developing in the world at the moment. I don't think it can be an either or. I think it is important not, as I say, to try to set China to one side, but actually to find a way of bringing China into that greater international order that has done well for the world for many years now.
There are many aspects to relations with China, and the focus on China is because its economy is growing so incredibly fast, and it's simply a force to be reckoned with. One aspect of relations with China that have come to be the focus of discussions also in the UK concerns one company in particular, Huawei. China has developed the best 5G technology in the world. It's undisputed. It's simply, people woke up and realized we need this 5G technology, and it's part of our infrastructure already, but there were concerns about national security in some countries, including the UK, a big debate about that, and in the United States as well. And some want to exclude Huawei, which has this 5G technology, from these countries. Did you see this Chinese tech giant as a threat to national security?
Well, this is an issue that I've looked at over a number of years now, both as Home Secretary in the Interior Secretary in the UK and as Prime Minister. And Huawei has been in the UK for some time now, and we had looked at the issues very carefully and took a view that it was possible for Huawei to continue to play a role, but not to be at the center of our development of 5G, not to be at the center of those systems, and to have a limited presence in other parts of the system. That, of course, has been changed, and we've taken a decision in terms of Huawei's removal from certain parts of the system over a period of years, partly as a result of the impact of sanctions taken by the United States, which does have an impact on us and an impact around the rest of the world. Each nation has to look at this issue of Huawei and security of systems according to their own structures and according to the systems that they have. That's what the UK did. but it has been affected, obviously, by a decision that was taken by the United States. But in a sense, the question for us, for the United States, for others, and particularly in the West, was why was it that the world suddenly woke up and discovered that Huawei was the one company that everybody was looking to for these systems? Why were there not more companies available to, and obviously there's a limited number of other companies. I don't need to tell anybody here in Korea about that, but why were there not more companies available to provide that? And so one of the things we want to do is working with our friends and allies is to try to see if we can encourage more of that marketplace to develop where there are options for countries to use rather than Huawei. But also to look at a firmer structure of international standards and rules in terms of that security that everybody can be abiding by and can have confidence in, so that we don't have this same issue where individual countries were having to make those decisions, but there's a greater acceptance of a set of standards that any such system or company providing parts of those systems have to abide by.
Countries Korea is kind of going back a little bit, but looking at economics here and how to respond to the challenges right now, and parallels perhaps between the UK and South Korea. Korea is pursuing a new Green Deal. A lot of countries that are pumping money now into recovery funds are saying, well, let's make things greener because the world is also having to deal with climate change and that challenge. When it comes to the UK showing leadership in this area, dealing with the new Green Deal that you guys have going, do you see any advice? Do you have any advice to offer to South Korea in the way it's developing?
Well, I was very pleased as Prime Minister. One of the things I did before I left office was to ensure that we put into legislation in the United Kingdom our target of net zero emissions by 2050. I would like to see more countries around the world adopting that and legislating for that target, and would hope that Korea can provide a beacon in doing so as well. I think the great lesson, and what we've seen in the United Kingdom, is the following. All too often, in dealing with climate change, the argument is made that you can either deal with climate change or you can have economic growth. This is wrong. The way of the future is dealing with climate change in a way that enables economic growth to take place. And that concept of greener growth, which I think will come out of the COVID, I think Ban Ki-moon referred to this, can come out of this pandemic, I think is the way forward for all of us. We have, in the United Kingdom, we've seen over the last 2-3 decades economic growth at the same time as we have been reducing our emissions at a faster rate than any other G20 country. So it is possible. Partly that has been about the encouragement of renewable energies, and we see significant developments having taken place, particularly in the use of wind as a renewable energy in the United Kingdom. But we're also actively promoting in the whole area of the electric vehicles, a whole variety, battery technology, a whole variety of different ways of dealing with this issue. But the key thing is not to see dealing with climate change as a challenge to economic growth, but to see it as a way to get economic growth for the future. And the reality is that unless we deal with climate change, where will any of our economies be in the future? Because as we already look around the world, we see more extreme and changeable and variable weather conditions and climate conditions, which countries are having to deal with increasingly. And that is a challenge to their economies. So the bushfires that we saw in Australia, the fires that we're seeing taking place in the United States, all of these come at a cost to the economy. So dealing with climate change is, it seems to me, something that we all have to face up to. But as I say, you can have economic growth at the same time, and green growth is the way to do this.
Sustainable growth, of course, is the paradigm that many countries are aiming for here. But increasingly, again, getting back to world affairs here and the pressures, this dichotomy between China and the United States as two superpowers locked in what our introductory video described as a new Cold War. It's debatable whether we should go that far in describing it, but there is a competition there, obviously. There's a trade war, for sure, going on between China and the United States, and countries also here in East Asia are caught in between to a degree. In Asia, the US, however, is expanding its so-called economic prosperity network as a counterweight, perhaps, to China's One Belt, One Road policy. South Korea is locked between these to some degree. Do you have any advice to South Korea in this situation to address its economic and security concerns in this pressurized situation?
Well, I'm not sure that it's for me to give advice to South Korea, but what I do think is what I said earlier, that in the world today, we see in world politics this move towards what I call absolutism, this sense that either you're 100% for me or you're 100% against me. And this leads to this challenge of this sort of you have to take one side or the other. Actually, the way forward for us all is to, it's not an either or. The way forward should be to find solutions for that multilateral agreements around the world that enable us all to provide the growth, the future for our citizens that we need and that we want. I think there is a great danger in the absolutism that we see in world politics today. It encourages and is encouraged by a greater sense of nationalism that we see in some countries. And I think that is problematic. I think that leads to a retrenchment, that leads to an isolationism, which is not good for any of us, not good for any of our developments and our economic growth and our young people's futures. So I think for those of us who believe in the values of, if you like, internationalism, of working together, of compromise, of a rules-based international framework, a rules-based international order, we all need now to be fighting for that more than we have had to do for some considerable time, because the challenge is much greater today.
A final question before we move on to audience questions, and it concerns Hong Kong, a former British colony, now in a transition phase going back to China. I want to just quickly ask you, how do you feel about the way that transition is going, particularly the way China is dealing with that transition?
Well, we have real concerns about some of the developments that have taken place recently in Hong Kong, and we believe that some of the actions that have been taken are contrary to the Sino-British Joint Declaration. I think we believe that the Sino-British Joint Declaration is something that continues and needs to be adhered to, and I would call on would want China to recognise that and to adhere to that. And I think some of the actions that have been taken, such as the new security law, are in contrary to that declaration. And as you may know, the United Kingdom has made clear its offer to those who have the right to come to the United Kingdom from Hong Kong.
Do you have any thoughts on alternatives to Hong Kong as a financial hub?
I suspect there are many parts here in this part of the world who will see that potential opportunity. But I think the good news is, I mean, obviously Hong Kong's role as a financial hub has been particularly important around the world. If it were the case that that changed, I think the good news is that there are already parts here, places here, who have that initial strength to be able to develop their role as financial centres. It wouldn't be a case of simply developing something from new.
Theresa May, thank you very much. I'm going to bring in a couple of questions now from the audience. I am told that the former Prime Minister, Han Duck-soo, would like to ask you something.
Thank you, Mrs. May. You emphasized that tackling climate change would bring a lot of changes in a lot of areas. Does it take any changes in conventional political philosophies of a conservative party like yours, including, the individual responsibility, small government, and financial consolidation? And also, does it take any changes in the basic, philosophies and prerequisites for political leadership? For example, from more general knowledge-based political leadership into political leadership with details and consistency and a strong implementation. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I think traditionally, and certainly we have seen in the United Kingdom, there was once a view that conservative parties were not the parties of the environment and dealing with issues like climate change. But as I say, in the United Kingdom, it is the Conservative Party that is the only party that has the word conserve in its name. And climate change is about conserving our planet for the future. And I think it is absolutely right, and I think it's important that conservative or centre-right parties have developed their approach to climate change and recognise the importance of climate change. It was my predecessor, David Cameron, as leader of the Conservative Party in the UK, who very much took a strong role in this. But in fact, one of the first world leaders to talk openly about some of these challenges in environmental terms was a former British Prime Minister, the first female British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, who many, many years ago spoke about these issues. So I think it is absolutely right for a Conservative Party to take these issues on, and it does not challenge our philosophy at all. In terms of individuals, I see dealing with climate change as not something that is just for government or just for business or just for individuals. We all have to work together and all have our part to play. So government can set the right legislative framework. I think there are many businesses that have already recognised the opportunities there are in the economy with climate change, and individuals can make a difference day by day in the small things that they do and the way in which we live, making changes in our use of fuels, making changes in the sort of vehicles we drive, and on other issues like plastics, changing our approach to the use of plastics. So it is for all of us to be working together in this. But I certainly see it important for centre-right and Conservative parties to have developed a philosophy in dealing with climate change. And as I say, I think it is natural for us to want to do so because we're parties that want to preserve our environment and pass it on to future generations.
And a final question from a lawmaker in the National Assembly here, Tae Young-ho.
Your Honorable Mrs. May, my name is Choi Yong-ho. I was North Korea's Deputy Ambassador to UK during your term as Prime Minister, but now I am a Member of Parliament in South Korea, so warm welcome again to my new motherland. Since UK is the permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, I have a question about UN sanctions on North Korea. You see now there are two positions on this issue right now, which actually sit at odds each other. One position is that North Korea's denuclearization process could be driven and encouraged through an early relief of economic sanctions, especially in the recognition of the impact of COVID-19 and recent natural disasters such as 3 typhoons affecting Korean Peninsula. But another view is that sanctions must maintain fully until North Korea takes significant steps towards denuclearization process with no early relief provided anytime soon. So, which of these two positions do you think will be better at encouraging North Korea's denuclearization process right now?
Well, first of all, it's very good to see you here in South Korea as a Member of Parliament here in South Korea. And I think, if I may, on overall terms, I think that President Moon's work to try to improve the relationships between North Korea and South Korea is very important. And I welcome the fact that he has taken steps in that, on that matter. On that issue of sanctions, though, the UK government's and the UK's view is very clear. We believe that sanctions should be maintained until we see that denuclearization. We want, as the world does, I think, to see that denuclearization of North Korea, but that has to be fully implemented, it has to be verifiable. And as I say, the UK's view is that sanctions should continue until we see that denuclearization.
Lady May, it has been a great privilege and an honor for me to be talking with you, to have our conversation. I want to thank you, and I think we should give her a warm round of applause. I know everyone out on the screen around the world will also be applauding you. Thank you very much for taking time to talk with us, and above all, for coming here. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lady Theresa May and Mr. Terry Martin, for a thoroughly engaging and meaningful session touching upon a broad range of issues. Ladies and gentlemen, please give them another big round of applause. Thank you very much.